Hello everyone, how are you this afternoon? Great. So thank you all once again for coming here to Ellenville and joining us in this conference. We are delighted that you came, and we hope you will continue to celebrate the brain and brain education. So, quick show of hands, how many of you attended Dr. Wesson's lecture this morning? Great, fantastic, thank you. I hope you will continue to learn more about the brain and how it functions, because you can really begin to appreciate at a very specific level what's happening in your behavior, your thinking, your emotions when you use the brain, and it will really help you to just have a more objective ability to evaluate your own condition and your behavior and to use it in a better way. So one more big applause for Dr. Wesson if he's still here. Great. So I would like to extend his talk a little bit by talking also a little bit about brain anatomy and function, but specifically how we might apply that kind of understanding for brain education. So as the title of the talk shows, this is about Jiangseng walking, but Jiangseng walking is really just one form of brain education. So, on that note, I'm just going to briefly recapitulate some of the information you heard yesterday morning when we talked about what the stages of brain education are. So, may I have the first slide, please? So, in the first place, this is a little quote from Hippocrates, who reminded us that people ought to know that from the brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and jests, as well as our pains, sorrows, griefs, and fears. So this is why we're doing brain education, because the brain is where everything is happening. Next slide, please. Here, we're just going to go very briefly down to a more microcosmic level, if you will. So going down to the basic signaling unit of the nervous system, and that is the neuron. So the neuron is the basic cellular type of the nervous system. And fundamentally, if we go down to laws of physics, it's about communicating information through electricity and chemistry. So in this picture here, you see a single neuron in cartoon form. In the middle, up in the upper left-hand area, you see a pink blob, and that's the cell body. This is where all of the real major activity of a cell takes place, such as storing energy or producing proteins or so forth. In the middle of that, there's a bright red blob. Again, this is just a cartoon. This is the nucleus. And of course, this is where we store the genetic material, which is a place where we have a sort of a cookbook for proteins, which go on to form the structures of our cells and create neurotransmitters and so on and so forth. So again, this is where we actually have the cookbook so that we can produce proteins. And on that same note, it's the way we transmit information from one generation to another. This has been one of the astonishing discoveries of the last 15 years in biology, that the DNA is where the code of life resides. So, out in the periphery from that pinkish cell, we have the dendrites. Now, you can think of these as being kind of like the ears or the receptors of a cell. It's where it picks up information from other cells. Down about that 4 o'clock position, you can see this long tail-like structure. That's the axon, and although it may look like a tail, you can actually think of it more as the mouth of the cell. So if the dendrites are where we were receiving information, the axon is where the information is going out. And you can see, by the way, that yellow fatty sheath there, that's called a myelin sheath. And what it does is allow that electrical impulse to conduct more efficiently and quickly. So this is the electricity that I mentioned before. Electricity literally fires down that axon at a speed of hundreds of miles per hour. Finally, at the tips of that axon, we see it branching off into little tiny branches, and that is what we call the axon terminals. And that is where each axon synapses, that is, connects to another neuron, and that's that point of communication through chemistry. So again, we talked about electricity and chemistry. This is where the chemistry takes place. And as many of you may know, this is also where a lot of medical therapies take place. We can give medicines to manipulate or influence the way different neurotransmitters communicate information from one neuron to another. So, quick tour, that's just one neuron, and you summate this neuron with the activities of roughly 100 billion other neurons, and you end up with really, in effect, an infinite potential of neuronal connections and states of activation. So this is one of the reasons why I truly believe it is true that our brains have infinite potential. They're connecting with each other in so many different ways, and it's been fairly said that the brain is the single most complex object in the known universe. Okay, next slide, please. So now let's take a step back and look at the brain from a much more macrocosmic perspective, and this is showing us the different lobes of the cortex. So cortex means bark, and it's the most evolutionarily advanced part of the brain. So I'll briefly share with you the functioning of some of these lobes. The frontal lobe you see on the far right there, right behind the forehead, this is where a lot of the most so-called advanced functions of the human brain take place. This is where we do our planning, selecting from different stimuli, inhibiting lower impulses. This is where we have the seat of choice even. So this is, again, the area that makes us feel most human and which seems to most distinguish us from other primates or other mammalian life forms. Now the parietal lobe right behind that, this is where we mediate much sensory awareness, as well as spatial awareness. And the temporal lobe, right by the temples, this is where we do much emotional processing, speech and language, hearing. And in the occipital lobe, very big part of primates, this is where we do vision. Now, again, that's just the cortex, so this is again, the most advanced so-called part of the brain. Briefly share with you some of the other structures we can see. Cerebellum down there, sort of shaped like a small fist or looks kind of like a cauliflower. This means little brain. And interestingly, the cerebellum, even though it's only about a tenth the size of the brain as a whole, it seems to have about half the number of neurons. And furthermore, those neurons have many more connections with other neurons than do the other structures of the brain. So there's an amazing amount of activity going on in the cerebellum. We once thought that it was mostly just used for motor balance, but now we appreciate that it's also very important for cognition as well, even for emotional processing. Down there at the bottom, that little stem-like structure, this is the spinal cord. This is where the brain connects to the rest of the body. The brain and the spinal cord make up what we call the central nervous system. And again, the spinal cord is where we can receive all that information from the periphery and then send out the control messages out to the muscles and the other organs of our body. Okay, so that's just a very quick Cook's tour of the outside of the brain, especially focusing on this neocortex, again, this new bark. Next slide, please. Okay, I just want to share with you a little bit about the anatomical specialization of the brain. So I mentioned before that we have these kind of functional differentiations so that different lobes of the brain are subserving different kinds of functions. Well, it turns out that the brain also has specialization by anatomy. So even within a specific function, for example, motor functioning, the ability to move around, or sensory function, the ability to feel, there's further specialization in the brain according to the part of your body. So we call this playful little diagram a homunculus. Homunculus means little man. And so what we see here is that different parts of the brain are serving those different parts of the body. Very interestingly, as you can appreciate there, huge territories of the brain devoted, for example, to the hand and the thumb, or to the face, the tongue, right? And we can appreciate this from evolution. Those parts of the brain were so important for our survival. And similarly with sensory function, big areas, big territories devoted to serving those functions. Now, one of the points I really want to highlight to you here is that this map is by no means fixed. And many of you here, being at the Brain Education Conference, I know will appreciate that in the last 20 years, we've learned an enormous amount about brain plasticity. That means that the brain is plastic or malleable, that is, it can change. We can literally rewire it so that it functions in a new way. And I will offer to you that that understanding of that fundamental character of the brain has scarcely been appreciated in either medicine or education or in our culture at large. Both the fact that the brain is serving all behavior, but also the fact that the brain can be rewired. And there are many amazing stories about how far we can go with brain plasticity and many wonderful books about this topic too. I encourage you to find out more about this general phenomenon about the brain. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just that same principle shown to you in kind of a volume form, and again, just showing you how much brain real estate, so to speak, is being taken up by our hands, our face, our tongue, our lips. Next slide. Thank you. Now let's just go from the outside in. Yesterday you heard from Ilchi Lee. He gave you a brief description of the three-layer structure of the brain. We're going to do the same thing here. This is the limbic system. So this is the so-called old mammalian brain, particularly important for subserving our emotions. And these emotions are what are so important for basic survival and social interaction behaviors. For example, approach or withdrawal. Why do we get fearful? Well, way back when, fear was a way to preserve our physical body. Why do we get joyful? Well, this is a way to express our cooperative spirit with other human beings, communicate with them, and collaborate on some kind of a project. So this, again, these are the ancient roots of our behaviors, and many of them are subserved by what we call this limbic system. Again, this second layer of the brain shared with basically the other early mammals. So I'm not going to go into all these structures here. I'm just going to mention one in passing because we've learned a great deal about it. The amygdala seems to be the place where we store a great deal of fear behavior, both unconditioned fear, that is, fear that's genetically programmed, and conditioned fears. So when we have some early experience in our lives that causes us to become fearful or inhibited, a lot of that processing of that behavior is actually happening in the amygdala. And I'll just mention one other fact about this. It turns out that stress is an amplifier of amygdala activity. So when you're engaging in some kind of a training or a practice or have done some brain education for yourselves to manage your stress response, this is one of the ways in which you're improving the quality of your life because you're not becoming as easily controlled by the fear responses of the amygdala. Okay, next slide, please. And the brainstem. The brainstem is that most ancient part of the brain, so-called reptilian brain, which subserves what's sometimes been called as the housekeeping functions of the brain. And now, how many of you have ever thought about telling your heart to beat? Right, sounds so silly. But in fact, this is what the brainstem is doing for us day in and day out without our ever having to ask it to, on a totally involuntary and unconscious basis. So because it's so out of sight and therefore somewhat out of mind, there's some tendencies to just ignore it, and we hardly even think about it. Even a lot of neuroscientists don't pay much attention to it because it seems so primitive and reptilian. But that may not be really the best way to think about the brainstem. And I'll just offer to you right now that, on the contrary, because it's doing all of these profound life-sustaining activities, including heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, digestion, immunity, and doing these things in a totally unconscious way, there's all the more potential that our brain is expressing and taking care of, which we, again, don't normally think about. This may be the great uncharted, mysterious territory even of the brain. And we even have some data coming from Korea now to show that some of these so-called subcortical structures may be very important for all kinds of higher cognitive functions. So stay tuned to that point. Hopefully we'll be able to share with you more at a future conference some data that we've collected. Next slide, please. So how does this all relate to brain education system training? Well, this is a poster that some of you may have seen in different places. Basically, brain education is a way to use our brain better, and it uses principles and facts that have been learned in neuroscience and applies them in ways to improve our quality of life. Next slide, please. Briefly, I want to share with you a little bit of data we collected here in New York a few years ago, and we collected information from people who were beginning brain educational programs, specifically training at the Dine Yoga Centers in this very area, and who we also gave these same questionnaires to after 3 months. And they showed remarkable improvements in health-related quality of life in all different domains. So this graph, the red on the left is where they were in the beginning. The blue on the right is where they were after 3 months. Now, it's almost really difficult to appreciate this because you just see this sort of stereotyped starts low, goes high in every single domain. But let me just sensitize you to the fact that these were very robust improvements. If you looked at this and compared it to other forms of physical exercise or lifestyle change, these are bigger effect sizes. These differences are bigger than what we would have seen in other kinds of physical activity. This is actually the reason why I got so interested to become a full-time brain education researcher. And secondly, the point here is that all domains of quality of life were influenced. This isn't a matter of just going to a gym to work out your physical body or just doing something for your emotional well-being or your cognitive well-being or so forth. This really had strong benefits across the board in all these different domains. Next slide, please. And this was from the same study. Again, this was published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine in 2004. A secondary outcome we looked at was depressive symptoms, trait anxiety, and self-efficacy. And this was particularly important to me. This was really the most important finding, I think, of this study. It increased people's sense of self-efficacy. That is a fancy way of saying their can-do spirit, their sense of confidence, I can do something, whether that be quit smoking, lose weight, take on a new challenge or job or what have you. People could feel more confident through doing brain education. Critical. Once you have that, all kinds of potentials are opened up. And conversely, if you don't have that, it's extremely difficult to make any kind of meaningful behavior change. Next slide, please. So, I just want to show you those slides that I just showed you, those tables and graphs rather. You can think of those as being the first step of brain education, the sensitizing step. This was the first 3 months of people who were doing this kind of training, and they really were just finally getting more in tune with their bodies, getting in touch with them more, and getting more sensitized. I'm going to briefly describe with you a kind of a general model for how you can think of these remaining steps of brain education using some cartoon pictures of the brain. So this is, again, a cartoon, not real, this depiction of how many of us are really using our brains in our daily lives. So just imagine or visualize yourself the course of any single day and what you're doing over the course of that day. Get out of bed, you put one leg over the bed and then the other, and you're brushing your teeth and picking up your beverage and so on and so forth. You're doing things in a way that is characterized by habit. And habits are often things that we do in some kind of a repeated way with even one part of our brain. And so literally, we know from first principles, we said before, if you're doing one thing repeatedly, well then you're using one part of your brain repeatedly. And we know, again, from first principles, that you will be using literally the same circuits over and over again. Next slide, please. So the purpose of versatilizing, the second step, is to really get you to use more of your brain in a more activated way, in a flexible way, so you can have any kind of fluency of concept or language or skill. And it can be as simple as learning how to write with your non-dominant hand, or learning how to create and express your emotions according to your desire. We don't have to be slaves to our emotions, but we can flexibly use them according to our intention. So this is all a matter of flexibilizing the brain from the body to the emotions to your cognitions. Next slide, please. Refreshing. So I mentioned to you how we have this limbic system from our early mammalian days, which especially has a tendency to hold fears. And we can we release those fears? Yes, we can, I would offer. And that is the burden of brain refreshing. So this, again, is a cartoon suggesting that in many ways our limbic systems can be clouded in different kinds of memories stored from early experiences which have no relevance to our current life. It can deeply and severely inhibit our desires, our intentions for fully living out the lives which we desire. Next slide, please. So again, the burden of brain refreshing is to be able to release these kinds of emotions, and not only emotions, but even concepts, right? So we all know that with so many changes in knowledge, whether it's scientific or technological or whatever kind of new information from this rapidly accelerating age, if you're not keeping up, it's very easy to become outdated, so to speak. So not only can you be inhibited by old emotions or memories, you can even be inhibited by being stuck in certain conceptual models. Next slide, please. Step 4, brain integrating. So this is really one of the unique stages of the brain educational process. And I mentioned to you how we have these three, you've heard many times, we have these three layers of the brain from our evolution. Well, as most of you appreciate, most of education is really targeted at that most advanced layer. It's about learning how to manage symbolic concepts, language, reasoning, abstract thought, so on and so forth. These are all of these frontal lobe functions which have given us the advanced literature and science and so forth. These are the things that education has really typically valued. Well, what does that leave us with the rest of the brain? Are these just primitive structures that we should ignore, or just how do we manage them? And sure enough, because we do not pay much attention to them, they tend to go off and do their own thing. And so again, this is a cartoon kind of depiction of what is happening in effect in most of us in this unintegrated brain state. We're thinking one thing, having some kind of visions or imagination or theories about whatever. We have some other set of emotions about that same phenomenon, which we may or may not even be aware of. And thirdly, this most ancient part of the brainstem, is going off on its own direction. We may be generating some kind of a panic attack or some kind of whatever. We don't even know that our body is reacting to that same phenomenon in some way that we have not become conscious of at all. So that's a big problem. If you're not aware of how your body is, if you're not aware of what your feeling is about something, but you're just stuck in your thoughts about some kind of a phenomenon. This is what we can call sort of the fractured state of our modern consciousness. And this has also been called the mind-body problem. Many, many different names, same problem. Next slide, please. So the burden of brain education is to integrate these layers. So get everything working together on the same page. Your thought about something is congruent, united with your feeling about it, is congruent with your gut-body reaction with it. You're thoroughly integrated. Every cell in your body is one with that phenomenon or idea or intention, so that there's no ambiguity and there's no uncertainty. You're in a state of what's been called flow also, where you just don't even have to think, you're just one with it. And I would offer to you that this is why we often admire so much phenomenal performance in any field, whether it be athletics or music or art or leading a business. We know that people who are cutting new territory in their fields are totally one with that purpose. Their bodies, their feelings, their thinking, totally united toward that intention. And by the way, I show this arrow going from the inside out, the bottom up, it's sort of to pay homage to our evolution. But I would offer to you that brain education is also about making that arrow go from the outside in. So it's using your brain in a way that you're literally using this higher functioning of the brain to program and create what's going on in these so-called lower or subcortical centers. I'm sure many of you have heard of phenomena ranging from the placebo effect to the incubation of ideas in your unconscious, to hypnosis, many different ways that we use our conscious ideas, our imaginations, to program our bodies in ways that are totally mysterious to us as yet, but to unleash amazing potentials which could not be created just by the thinking mind alone. Next slide, please. Right, so that is all I want to share about brain education for now. I wanted to give you that very brief tour, but now I want to give you the full benefit of one example of brain education, which is Jiangsang walking. So, Jiangsang walking means longevity walking. And longevity is something that we all wish for, but we want to have longevity in a way that's got a very strong health-related focus. So we want to live well and not just long. So the point here is that we can live well through walking through all these different ways. Okay? These are just a handful of the studies that have shown the different health benefits of regular walking, but what I'd like to show you today is a way to walk that may even give more of the benefits than walking alone. So, before I start that, let me just quickly ask, because I don't want to shift gears too rapidly here, did anyone have any questions about the brain education half of this talk? I'm giving you kind of a 2-for-1 today. Okay, great. So, totally clear on brain education. I love it. So, now that we're going into the Jiangshan walking, let me ask one more question here. How many of you walk regularly every day? Terrific. Looks like about a quarter of you. Now, can someone share just briefly any kind of experience you have with your walking habit? Anyone? Yes. You have ideas coming to you when you walk. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, I like to walk the first thing in the morning because I'm a slow riser, so it wakes me up, gets my body moving, gets me in a good mood to start the day.
Terrific. So it's a great way to start the day and get your physical body activated. Anyone else? One more sharing about the experience or value of walking for them. In the back there.
I got the experience of 3 days walking not long ago. I had a broken bone in my foot that affected my knee, and that knee affected the other one. I went to my doctor and I says, Beatrice, walk. Doctor, I need therapy. I asked him. He says, I need it. It's hurting a lot. Walk. It's something to ease my pain. Walk. So I don't have no choice. I walk 15 minutes and come back home. It's still there. Next day, I walk a half an hour and come back, and it was better. And the third day, I walk all the way to the park, about a mile, and come back, and the pain disappeared. My muscle probably was affected.
Fantastic.
And so that's one experience of the walking.
Thank you. So actually, these 3 sharings tell us a great deal about how powerful walking can be, and it is a form of brain education. You heard from Ilji yesterday that brain education is not some very special way of understanding your brain. It's really a very practical way of using your brain. And when you're using your brain in all these ways to generate ideas, to energize yourself in the morning, to heal pain, you are using your brain in a way that's improving the quality of your life. And so I'm going to, again, share with you one simple technique that we can use to augment or improve the character of our walking to get even a bigger, stronger bang for the buck out of your walk. Okay, so first slide, please. First step here is to focus on the pelvic tilt. Some of you may have learned this already if you've ever encountered a condition of back pain and been given some instructions about how to use your body. It turns out that by positioning your lower pelvis and tilting it ever so slightly, you can create a more stable condition for your lower back and your sacroiliac joint that will stabilize your entire torso. Okay? So this particular little technique is the foundation of the Jiangshan method, and once you get this down, all of the other steps will really come very naturally. So we're going to practice this in just a moment, and while we're doing this, by the way, I'll also show you a little trick you can use to put your back flat against the wall and use your hand right in between the lower back and the wall itself to just sort of sandwich your hand in there and feel your lower lumbar area being squeezed in toward the wall. So again, we'll go over this in just a moment, but this is again the key of the Jiangshan technique, just to let yourself get into that gentle pelvic tilt position. Next slide. Focus on your lower abdomen. So This is the sort of core of your body. Many physical training traditions talk about your core or your gut or your power center. Again, this is a great place to focus your attention as you're walking. Next slide. Let your heel tap the ground gently as you step forward with a straight leg. The point here is that instead of striking your heel hard on the ground, you're going to just gently tap it on the ground. And what you'll find is that because your momentum is shifted forward slightly because of your pelvic tilt, you're automatically putting your weight more on the front part of your foot rather than on your heel. We'll show this again in just a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, feel your weight transfer fully to the balls and toes of your foot. This is just an extension of the last idea. Again, instead of doing a harsh heel strike against the ground, you're allowing the full weight to come on the forward part of your foot. This is also called the Yong Chon in Oriental health theory. That means the spring of courage. Next slide. And that spring of courage in Oriental health theory is very important for your general life vitality, for your kidney energy. And that kidney energy line is shown here. Next slide. If you want to look from a musculoskeletal point of view, the soleus muscle is where we generate the ability to actually press off on the ball of the foot. So this part of the leg, very interestingly, this soleus in the gastrocnemius, it weakens as we age. So this is a wonderful way to give a little workout to the calf muscle, the soleus and the gastrocnemius, by putting that weight on the forward part of your foot. Next slide. Keep your feet parallel, walking on either side of an imaginary line. Next slide. And angle your body 1 degree forward. By the way, this technique is a way to use your body to guide your mind and your thinking. So again, we've talked about how we can use our brain-body connection. We all know that when we assume a particular position of the body, our thoughts or emotions can follow. And by having our body just angled ever so slightly forward, you can feel more confident and purposeful about your walking. Next slide. Relax your shoulders. Next slide. Swing your arms freely. So this is a very important step here. Now, many of us, especially the men with the pockets, have a tendency to get into a habit of walking around like this. And I'll offer to you, it's a very different experience to walk like that and to walk with your arms fully swinging. So why would this be so? Maybe 2 reasons. One is based on pure physics and momentum. By swinging your arms to the side, you're creating a kind of a pendulum effect. You've got 2 arms swinging there like pendulums, and it creates more physical forward momentum for your walk. Your walk becomes more efficient. Secondly, let's go back to that story of the brain. Well, we know that half of your brain is always controlling and regulating the opposite side of the body in general. So when we're using just one part of the brain repeatedly, one part of the body, either with our writing instrument or our computer mouse or so forth, we're repeatedly stimulating only one side or part of the brain. Walking is one activity in which you are always stimulating both sides of the brain in a symmetric fashion and for a prolonged period. And I would offer that may be why a lot of folks find that they have ideas or insights coming up. They can calm their emotions. They may have a different outlook on a situation or some new situation in their life. It's by using both sides of the brain in a symmetric way. So next step is, oh, it's already up there, to smile. And smiling is very important in general, just to make yourself feel the full activation of the limbic system in a positive way. So again, this is a way to really use your brain in a conscious effort to, again, activate all 3 different layers. So, next slide. Jiangseng walking, briefly summarized, designed for us to strengthen the soleus muscle in the legs, to accumulate power in the lower abdomen, to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, something I didn't talk about but I'm going to mention in just a moment, and to walk with confidence and purpose. So, any questions about this material so far? Please.
that was helpful. Helpful not to be able to rotate your
Right.
hips as you move.
Right, so the question is whether we should rotate the hips as we're doing this. In fact, you'll find that once you do that pelvic tilt, you'll find that your whole torso gets more stabilized. So you don't have to consciously move your hips so much, and you'll find that your walk, your stride actually becomes a little bit shorter, and the whole feeling of your body is more, again, stabilized. So it's actually a little bit the opposite of moving it more. It's actually moving it a little bit less. Okay, and we'll go to the next slide, please. So these are just those 9 guidelines summarized. Any other questions about how to do it, the mechanics? Because we're going to practice this in just a moment. Go ahead.
When you are tilting your pelvis forward, sometimes I notice that I tense up my abdomen. I was wondering if you had any comment on whether or not.
Right, and now definitely you're going to feel a little bit of contraction in your abdominal muscles, and you don't want it to be actual tension or pain by any means, but you will feel a little bit of a contraction there and a little bit of pressure, and that's a good thing. So yes, you want to feel that.
Doing with your breath.
So the breath should be as natural as possible. Just be very easy and comfortable with it. As you accumulate experience with this, you can find that not only are you focusing on your abdomen, you can also breathe with your abdomen. So as many of you may know, when we're breathing with our chest, we're sucking in air. We're really trying to increase oxygenation to our cardiovascular system to supply our muscles as part of the whole fight or flight response. And so when you're breathing with your chest, you're actually in a very mild stress mode. If you can breathe with your abdomen, you're actually activating this parasympathetic, or that is this digest and rest and stress management part of the autonomic nervous system, which is going to allow you to have a much more peaceful experience in your walk. It's a little bit advanced for this talk to talk about the breathing piece, but definitely keep that part in mind. Anyone else? Okay, so I like to make this talk as practical as possible, so I'd like you to all to just stand up briefly, please, so you can actually feel what the posture feels like and then actually practice the walking. So first, just standing, and before you do the pelvic tilt, which is that first step, I'd like you to just kind of assume an opposite posture. Imagine yourself as a Marine, and you're in basic training, and you've got your shoulders back and your chest out, and you're standing at attention. Okay, now notice how your body feels as you're doing that. Now gently soften your knees and tuck the lower part of your pelvis forward, and feel your belly, your abdominal muscles contract ever so slightly, and now you're in that nice pelvic tuck posture. You'll notice that you've also got your weight, 85% or more, on the forward part of the balls of your feet at this point. You may even want to close your eyes for a moment just so you can fully feel your body sensations. And also focus on your lower abdomen. Feel that gut sensation. The weight on the forward part of your feet. Shoulders nice and relaxed. And focusing on your abdomen. Okay, you can open your eyes and just, again, notice how your body feels now. Anyone want to share something about how they felt as they were standing in that position with the balls of the feet forward and their pelvis tucked? Anyone?
Well, I felt when I was like a Marine, tension, and my breath became quite short in the chest. I felt my spine being too much in the front, my bum too much sticking out. And when I did the proper posture, all of a sudden my breath went all the way down, and I was much more relaxed, and I could feel the energy coming in through the young chants.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, did anyone notice any heat or even sweating as they were standing there? Yeah, right. Did anyone notice just a little bit of dampness or saliva in your mouth? Handful, a couple. Okay, we only did this for about a minute, so it was still very subtle, but I'll offer to you that you should try this again later and do it for prolonged periods and keep doing it until you feel both the heat, the sweat, the energy sensation, the circulation, and also even a little bit of calm and even a little bit of dampness or saliva in your mouth. And there's a reason for that, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, but in the meantime, I'd like to briefly give us a chance to walk this way. So keeping that same pelvic tilt and keeping your weight on the forward part of your feet, I'd like us just to go ahead and just make a little circle, just make a loop, one loop around this room, around these chairs, just so you can actually practice this method of walking for about 3 to 5 minutes. So first we can walk in a, in a clockwise fashion. Make a big loop around these chairs. And you'll find that even when you take these small steps, you can still swing your arms freely. Okay, that was a very short time, but even in that short time, you may have experienced something. Does anyone want to share something they felt as they're walking that way?
Helped me with my arthritis. I wasn't limping.
Wow, thank you. Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just noticed in the beginning when I was walking slower, it was hard to do it. But I felt like you can't walk too slow and you can't walk too fast. I was noticing that, and then when I felt like I really got it, I had forgotten about the smile part of the thing, but then it suddenly just made me smile automatically because feeling my arms kind of sway like that, it just felt kind of funny. So I noticed the smiling coming naturally, and it was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
My legs felt a little fuller, kind of becoming solid, and then I could definitely feel my lower abdomen getting warmer and actually sort of had expanding feeling, getting tighter,
Thank you.
and my hands were getting heavy.
And your hands were getting heavy. Okay, thank you. Wonderful. So we can see that even in this short time of walking, maybe 3 minutes, you can experience some different kind of feeling through something as simple as walking. And I encourage you to use this as one way to walk, whether it's just for a short time or whether you're going on a 2-mile walk, that's really going to change your experience of your walk and also possibly impact your health condition. So, and I'm just going to briefly share with you how that might be in these last few slides. So I mentioned to you already that walking has so many benefits. If I could put it into a pill, it would be a blockbuster medicine. Everything from heart conditions to diabetes, helping to reduce the risk of cancer, mood conditions, the list goes on. But I'm going to offer to you once again that this may be a simple way to even better get benefits from your walk. So next slide, please. So to do that, I'm going to briefly introduce to you the autonomic nervous system. And we touched on this in the first half of the talk when we talked about the brainstem. So again, the brainstem is regulating all these unconscious, involuntary functions. Well, the autonomic nervous system is the peripheral component of that involuntary response. 2 major divisions. One is called the fight or flight, or sympathetic response. The other is called the rest and digest, or parasympathetic response. These 2 systems are always in a dynamic balance with each other. We're always in some readiness state to either become more activated, that is for more stress or reaction type of behavior, or more calmed down, that is more kind of a stress management kind of situation. And again, the fight or flight mediates increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, even helps you to sweat, shuts off your digestion. The parasympathetics will actually mediate the opposite of those, helps you to calm your heart rate down, to improve your digestion, to get your digestion going, bring your blood pressure down. It turns out that that dynamic balance is probably contributing to a lot of the health conditions of older age. So it's chronic overactivation of that stress side of the equation, which contributes to problems ranging from high blood pressure to diabetes to different kinds of circulatory problems, cold hands, digestive problems, so on and so forth. So the question could be, what can you do to fix that? Well, there are medicines that we give to actually help block some of the reactions of that stress response, but importantly, it turns out that there are ways that we can stimulate that response ourselves. And the Jiangsang walking method is one way to do that. What we're doing is doing a physical posture which actually influences the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. Specifically, that first step, that pelvic tilt, there's good evidence to suggest that that simple body maneuver can actually stimulate greater activation of your parasympathetic nervous system. So this is a way to activate your innate system for self-regulation of your stress response. That's the real punchline of the Jiangsang walking method. Next slide, please. This is again just reinforcing the point that the parasympathetic activity declines with age. So I mentioned to you how that imbalance in those two divisions can contribute to the problems of aging. Sure enough, when we measure it, people who are older, and that's what we see on this horizontal axis, the older folks, they have less tone in the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, anything we can do to activate that system and to better manage stress is going to improve our overall health. Next slide, please. And this is just showing what happens when you do regular versus Jiangsang walking. The first graph on the top is just showing how the heart rate stays relatively the same when you're doing a normal walk. The second graph at the bottom shows huge up and down movements. Your heart rate is going up and down and up and down. We call this heart rate variability, and it's an example of the importance of having flexibility in your autonomic system. So the point here is not that you want to shut off your stress response and increase your anti-stress response. The point is that you want to have dynamic flexibility in those two systems, to be able to go up when it's necessary, to be able to come down when it's not necessary. So this is, again, a way to sensitize and even versatilize your brain by being able to keep that dynamic, use it as necessary function for any of your brain systems. So this, again, is the kind of quantitative way to understand the benefits of Jiangsang walking. So, any questions about this material? I think we have time for one question. Yes?
Tucking in your pelvis. I'm always not sure whether it's really tucked or not. Any hint, easy hint to make sure it's tucked or not?
Yes. You know what? We were going to do that, and because of time, I didn't do it. But in terms of tucking the pelvis, the easy way to do that again, was that the question, how to tuck the pelvis? Right. So put your whole body against a wall flat, from the head to the buttocks to the heels. Feel that small of your back, lower part of your back where it curves out, and just sandwich that part of your back. Sandwich your hand between that part of the back and the wall itself. So to make that space get smaller. It won't completely disappear, but it will get smaller. And when you do that, then you've assumed this position of tucking the pelvis forward, tightening up the abdominal muscles, and actually also strengthening the core muscle of your body, the iliopsoas, which goes from the lumbar spine down to your thigh bone. So you're strengthening the core muscle, gentle pressure on this abdominal area, and again, it looks like that's stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, great. So that's all the time we have for today, and I deeply appreciate once again that all of you have come here today, both to enjoy the conference and to learn a simple walking method. I hope you will use this as a way to use your brain well, and that you'll continue to enjoy the rest of this conference, including the award ceremony tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.